Right, so if some mesh is placed, then the first thing you should do, and the easiest thing to begin with, is apply some detail normal mapping. So we have our rock here, and it gets a little bit blurry, as you can see. It's quite big as well. The texture is actually too small for the size that the rock has, but when you get close to it, let's say you want to improve the situation a little bit by adding detail normal mapping to it, or detail mapping would be the same as detail normal mapping. So what we do is we go back to the rock material, and we have a normal map here. First of all, what we're going to do is we're going to blend a small tiling normal map texture on top of our big unique normal map, and we're going to blend the two together. So the small one is going to give some detail when you get up close, because it's going to tile a lot. So it's going to give some very fine detail when you look very close up, and the big one is meant for the overall look and feel of it. So first thing we need to do is we need to find a small tiling normal map we can use for a detail normal map. So I'll go back to the content browser, and I'm going to look in, I don't know exactly where it is, but I think if I just look for detail in engine, but UDK game probably has more. So I'm just looking for the word detail, and you can see we find a couple of detail normal maps here. I can find the one that you think fits you best. Perhaps this, it's a bit more neutral, or actually let's take the more aggressive one, just so it's obvious in the video what's happening. So I'll take that one. I'm adding it over here. Then I add a texture chord to it, texture coordinate, because I want to display this a lot smaller than this one. It should be tiled aggressively. So I'm going to tile it, say 20 times, so that's probably not even enough. So it looks like that, very smallly tiled. And then I want to blend that with this. However, I can't just do this. I can't just multiply them together, and I can't just add them together. That's not a very good idea. One of the reasons why it's not a good idea is because the blue channel should be left unmodified. This one should be left as is. We should only be modifying red and green, the two directions, but the height should be left as is. So in order to do that, I'm going to use something called a component mask. And a component mask, it will only let certain things through. So whatever goes in, it will only let red and green through. You can set in the properties what it lets through. Blue will be dropped. So the moment this comes out again, it will have forgotten blue. And that's good, because you only want to work with red and green of a detailed normal map. Then I will multiply that with just a constant, because then this gives me control over how intense the detailed normal mapping is. Make it 2, it's going to be much too intense, but just to start out with. And then, next problem is that if I were to now add this on top of that, something might go wrong, because this is actually only made of red and green, and this is red, green, and blue. So it's a bit of a mismatch there. Red, green, and blue gets combined with red and green. So I'm going to make sure that this one becomes red, green, and blue again by itself as well, by adding a black blue channel. There's something called append, and an append vector is pretty much the opposite of that. Rather than starting to split up the channels of what goes in, it starts to combine the channels again. So what I could do is, just for the sake of example, if I take this one for a moment, if you take just red, then what I can do is this, basically. I can combine red and green. Now the output of this is red and green, red, green. If I then add another append and I append the previous result with blue, the output of this is now exactly the same as this. This is the red, green, and blue output. It basically combines two channels, and if you keep appending, it takes the previous results and adds yet another channel. So this two combines red and green, and this one combines red and green output with blue. Therefore, this becomes red, green, and blue again. And that's what I'm doing here, is this is red and green, and I add a new blue channel on top of this. This becomes a new blue. I add an empty black blue on top. So now I have a red and green texture with no blue. Well, a black blue, looking like this. And then we simply add that on top of the original. So I simply add the two together, the detail normal map with the original normal map. And as you can see, now I have some small details on top. Scale is probably should be smaller. Let's look in the viewport. So yeah, that kind of works. And you can see this number now sets the intensity. In the same way, you could also scale the intensity of that one if you were to wish to do so. You could simply multiply then with a constant 3 vector. And then blue again should always be left unmodified. So blue is 1. 1 times something is the same. So blue is left unmodified. But the other ones I can now increase or decrease to make it more, to make the normal map more pronounced. So I made it 8 times as powerful now. It's also darker. I think the detail normal map is a bit too big still, so I can go back to the texture coordinate and make it smaller. That's perhaps a bit better. It's a little bit plastic-like. And again, the texture is actually too blurry, but for the sake of the example, you understand what is going on. Next up, we're going to set up the plant, so the dry shrub. What I'm going to do is temporarily add the dry shrub to the world. Like that. Because we're going to be doing a couple of things to it. First of all, we're actually going to be painting this as foliage. So rather than doing this, which is going to be a lot of work, and it's actually very inefficient performance-wise, because again, this is one draw call for each plant, and each plant is only 4 triangles big, so it's extremely inefficient. We're going to be adding this as foliage instead. There's a tool here called Foliage Mode, gives you that window, and this allows you to paint meshes you add to it. So if I simply click and drag this into the bottom area, it gets added. Before we're able to use this in this tool, however, we should note that in the mesh itself, we need to enable following property. It says here, used for instancing. This should be enabled if it's used in the foliage tool. Also, we should note that the light map size should be rather small, so I'm going to lower it to 16 instead. Because what will happen is that it's going to render all of the plants painted in foliage mode as one big model. Or actually it will at one point split it up, but the first 100 or so are going to be rendered all together. That's what makes it so much faster, not only faster to use, but also faster to render, because it will render all of the plants at once. However, because it does that, it also can only use one light map for all of the plants. And if you have 100 light maps, so if you have 100 times a 32 light map, you might run out of the maximum space allowed. So it's usually a good idea to keep the light map size of foliage quite small. So I brought it down to 16. Okay, I'll delete the plant I have in a level. And then I can just paint this one. You can set the density here. And I have the brush size and such. So I made it a bit small. I just hold Control, click somewhere, click and drag while holding Control, and it paints plants. You can remove them by Control Shift, click and dragging. Also there is a tool here that's the arrow here that allows you to select an individual plant it painted, so you can actually still move all of the individual plants you made. I'm going to set the scale a little bit better, minimum scale 0.5, maximum 0.75 perhaps. And then I'll just paint around a bit. I'm going to increase the density just for the cases, for the sake of example. It says actually, if you press the I here it actually says how many clusters you have. Every cluster is one model basically, and it says here per cluster there's 100 instances per cluster. I have 378 plants painted, Therefore, this will render in 4 draw calls in 4 clusters. You can mess with the numbers to reduce the number of clusters. So now it actually renders faster than this. However, at some point you will run out of light map space. Now it's only 1 cluster, so I'm going to keep it at 200. That should do. You can also mess around a bit with the settings here of the lighting. That's the foliage tool in a nutshell, not really what the video is about. In any case, at least we have the plants in now. And then we can continue working on the material. So I'm going to go continue on the material, quickly save it, and then let's go. There's 2 things we really need to do here. First of all, every plant is exactly the same. It has different scale and has different rotation, but it's otherwise the same. I would like to have a different brightness, a different color perhaps, between each plant. And I would like to set up wind, so they actually move in the wind. I'm going to start with the wind, because setting it up, having the color change per mesh, that's something that also ties into the road and landscape. So we'll do that later on. So let's start with the wind. And if you may remember, is that in the very beginning, what we did with our plant is we vertex colored it. So not only did we change the vertex normals, we also applied a black vertex color to the bottom. And that's something that we're now going to use. You have something called world position offset, and that's actually going to distort the vertices of the mesh. So it actually takes the vertices of the model and it will distort those. It will push them away, it will offset them. And that's what we're going to use to create wind. This is going to be quite a big complex setup, but it's at least not as complex as what Epic did. So as an introduction, let's see what Epic did. In the foliage demo, let's try to find a material here. For example, that one. Shane Plant 02. Well, what I did is this. It's a little bit over the top, as you can see. We're going to do something similar, but we're going to greatly simplify this setup. This is a very nice setup, but you can do it in a simpler way. You might not get all the small details that this does. This is going to give a better result. But as a start, you can do it simpler than this, because this is much too big to start out with. But we're going to be doing something that's very similar to that. So this whole entire big setup, all of this is responsible. As you can see, all of this connects to world position offset. All of this is the wind on the plant. Everything else, all of this, that's just the plant itself. And all of this is the wind. Okay, so first of all, what we need to do is we need to know where in the world the mesh is. Because in order to have it move in the wind, we need to know where it's located. So what I'm going to get is an object world position. And this will tell me the location of the mesh it is applied to. So for every mesh, this will output different numbers. And then you multiply the object world position with a constant tree. So this one will allow you to set the intensity of the wind and what direction the wind goes into. So this is basically, it's red, green and blue, but red, green and blue should always be read as well as X, Y, Z. So this will output a position in the world, just like this will do so. Then before we can, however, combine these two, we need to convert this into a different, into the world, into something that's similar to object world position. And to do that, we have something called transform. So we're going to transform a simple constant tree vector into something else. And we're going to transform type. We're going to make it local instead. So local transform type, source type, and transfer type is simply world as it was. And those two get multiplied together. The numbers I have to start out with, let's say 3, 3, 2. It's a bit too high, but just to see what will happen. And actually we can probably already assign this, and then you can just see if there's any result. So this simply removes it, not very good. What we then have to do is you have to make sure it moves back and forth in the wind. We need this continuous movement where it moves in the wind back and forth. And a simple way we can do that is by adding a time and a sign. So it's something called time and sign. Here we have a time. Time simply outputs time. It doesn't do anything whatsoever by itself. It's simply a moment in time. But a sine or a cosine, it's kind of the same thing. This creates a continuous wave out of whatever goes in. So if I input time into sine, this will make a continuous wave that goes up and down, etc. This will push the input up and down all the time. You can set the speed of that in here. Period is how fast it goes. If you increase the number, it goes slower. So I'm going to use this to move the object back and forth in the wind the whole time. In fact, I'm going to use two of these, or in just two signs at least, two different signs based on the same time, to create two different waves. This is a slow wave, and this is going to be a fast wave, like 0.25. And then I add those two together. What I'm after is a more random result than simply doing this. So what I have now by combining two of these is it gets a bit more random. See, now it was a short wave, more aggressive wave, so it gets a bit more random. There's various ways of doing this, but this is the simplest way of adding a bit more random effect to it. And then you simply multiply these two together. So this is the wave, this is the position in the world, and now you make the position in the world dependent on the wave and the other way around by multiplying them together. Then I'm going to multiply them with a number, so just a constant. And this is so I can control the strength of it, because right now it's going to be way too powerful. And I connect it to the end. This number is basically the wind strength. So I'm going to make it quite a small number here, something like that, 0.0002. And then we can see in the world what happens. There's a real-time preview button, try to enable that. And you can see it moves back and forth. If I increase the number, it will move a lot more, way too much actually. Let's a bit more, a bit less. And now we have this. You can already see the problem here, the entire plant moves, which is not very realistic. And this is why we have the vertex color, because now we can use a vertex color to mask it in, to lock it into only the top vertices. So I connect multiply here with another multiply, and I find a vertex color in the expression list, and this vertex color exposes the vertex color assigned to it in the material, in the mesh, sorry. It was black and white, so it doesn't really matter which color you pick. I will just pick red, for example, because if it's black, all colors are black. See how that looks. And now we have that. Still really weird, but the bottom of the plant remains on position. And you can also see that these number, if you were to tweak this is how much it goes up in height. So if I make that, okay, that's maybe a bit too much, but 10, it's gonna go up and down a lot more. So this one actually also controls strength along with this one. Technically, you could probably just remove this one and solely use that, but that aside. So I'm going to make the height quite small, 0.5, and I'm going to just make it 1 and 1 on these two. Gets a bit better. So the moving back and forth again, that's the time and the sign. But the fact that they don't all move at the same time, however, that's because of the world position. If we were to only use time and sign, if we were to skip the whole world position thing and only do this, that would probably move faster, but then everything would move at the same time or not at all. Actually, not at all. See, now everything moves at the same time. And that's very unrealistically. So what we do is we take the position in the world and we multiply that with a time and sign. Therefore, every instance, every bit of grass or every shrub, every plant moves at a different pace because the two are multiplied together. and it looks a lot more random. And this kind of works as settings. So I did a multiply eventually with 0.001, and the number over here is 110.5. There's also one property here at the bottom that I tend to use for everything that's foliage, and that is that I tend to change the lighting model from Phong to non-directional. This has kind of the same purpose as changing the vertex normals on the mesh. So remember, by changing the vertex normals on this, we made sure that the mesh looks more uniform. See, the lighting remains uniform rather than this, where one side becomes much darker. Non-directional has kind of the same impact. It softens out the light, so you don't get any hard shading. So I'm gonna enable that. It's probably gonna make it a little bit brighter. There we go. That also looks brighter and it looks more uniform. Next up then is making sure that every shrub has a different color. This is not that obvious with the shrubs because they're dry and dark. But imagine you would have a field of grass. You wouldn't want the entire field of grass to have the exact same color and the exact same brightness. That makes it very artificial. Grass has a different color depending on where it grows. Maybe there's more water in the ground, for example, and the grass is greener there, etc. Maybe there's more direct sunlight, maybe there's more shadow. So the color of grass or the color of any foliage will change depending on a lot of different factors. So if you want to try to make this a bit more natural, what we can do is we can make sure, in the same way that we make it move differently depending on its world position, we also can color it differently depending on its world position. Again, we begin by getting the position in the world. However, this time we're not going to use an object world position, but a normal world position. The difference between the two is not that big, but I've once been told that if you use it in foliage for wind, it should be object, and otherwise world position itself works better. You can try out to just replace the two with each other and see what happens. There's a bit of a difference, but in this case, to my experimentation in any case, world position works better for the color, which is what we're going to do now. So we have the position in the world of the mesh that's using the material. Then what we need to do is we need to filter out two channels. Show you in a little bit why we do this, but I add a component mask which has only red and green enabled, no blue. Red, green and blue should also be read as X, Y, Z. So we're dropping the height here. We're only looking at X and Y. And then we need to make sure the number is smaller because the number is way too big. So I'm going to multiply it with a very small number. Something like 000, 3 zeros after the comma 1. The reason why this is because the world position, the coordinates in the world are rather large. If we just look here and we look at the rock, for example, well, that's positioned on 3280, for example. Well, 3280 is a very big number for the material editor. So if we were to do 3280 multiplied by that, we will get 0.3218. And that's much more workable. That's within the 0 to 1 range. So that's why we're scaling this. So now we have a more workable, smaller number. And what we're going to add then is something called a merge map. So in the content browser, you have this one, the funny looking colored thing called cloud. This is something that we touch upon in the second video. But for now, I'm going to very briefly explain you what it does. It's basically 3 different textures in one. It's 3 different grayscale clouds in one. The red channel contains this, the green channel contains this, and the blue channel this. So it's 3 different patterns combined. You won't use the 3 ones combined, but you will use the 3 independently of each other. And the reason why we do this is because it's much more memory efficient. So for now, we're going to use the red one. We're going to be using this image to color the plants because it has a lot of tiny variations between black and white. So take this one into your material. And then what we do now, and this is something that we will also do for the road and for the landscape, is we're going to planar map this material in here. By connecting this to the UV input, we're actually projecting this texture in the editor. We have the projection done by the engine. So it's not actually using any UV coordinates. The UV coordinates are generated in the editor. And I can show you what happens if you very simply connect the black box RGB here to diffuse. So like that, just for the case of showing you what happens. Press OK. Then you will get this. And it can be hard to see, but you can already see there's a difference in color between each plant. See, for example, here suddenly they get red, yellow. So the color changes, and that's because it is a texture projected. The clouds, this texture is projected upon all of the plants from above. It's a planar map on Z coming down. We'll continue on that with the road, and it will get more obvious once we get to the road and to the landscape as exactly what's happening here. For now, I'll continue. We're going to use this texture as an alpha for a lerp. So this texture is going to be the alpha, and this texture will determine if we see the original plant texture. This A is the original diffuse texture, and B is the original diffuse texture but darker. Now before I go there, I'm first going to use two colors just so it's very obvious what's going on. So I use two constant 3 vectors, which I use on A and B instead. One is red, the other one is green. So we'll have a very clear picture of what's happening. And then I will use this as alpha. Can try that. And you can see what's happening now. The plants change color dependent on position. They pick a color in between red and green, depending on where they are placed. We will then use that, rather than having two of these colors in, we will use A is, like I said, the original diffuse texture, B is the original diffuse texture, but darker or more colored. So I'm going to multiply that with a color, and that's then B. The color is going to be, say, 0.2, 0.1, 0, something dark red. So we will have a dark red version of the diffuse texture. Or actually, I managed to make it green, I believe. No, that should be fine. Oh, actually, I used RGB here. That's wrong. It should be just red. That's also why the color was wrong, actually, in the previous example. And this might be hard to see again. Doing this on shrubs is perhaps not the most obvious thing. If you were to do this on a big field of grass, it would be much more obvious what's going on. But this makes some of the plants darker than other ones. See, for example, this whole group is darker than, say, this one, etc. So you get a bit of a variation. This is obviously brighter here. So you get variation in the foliage. This exact same setup can also be used on the road. So next step is we're going to do the same thing on the road. Because you can see what we want to get is that the road blends in with the landscape and it's not just placed on top. So we need a bit of sand on the side of it. We go to the road material. And then I'm going to bring in the same sand texture that I wanted to blend with, which is, say, well, that one is perhaps a bit weird. Let's take soil 2, it's more fitting. And then let me quickly change the soil on the ground as well to soil number 2. There we go. Now it looks like that. So we're going to do the same setup here. We're also going to take the world position like we just did. And then we're also going to take out just red and green. So we use a component mask again. And then we have to make the number smaller. Previously I used to multiply. However, you could also simply divide. Divide or multiply, it leads to the same result. If you divide by 10, that's the same as multiplying by 0.1. So I will divide by 400. That appears to work quite well. And then that goes into the UVs of the sand. And then I'm going to temporarily connect the sand to the roads. So the whole road will be sand. Now you can see what happens. This is now no longer using the UV coordinates of the road. It's actually projected in Unreal. If I move the road, you can see the texture actually stays in place, whereas the mesh is moving. And this is exactly what we want, because by doing this, we can align the road with the ground, because both are projected in Unreal rather than UV map. Because of that, they will both blend in with each other. And this is also what we did with the foliage. We blended the black and white cloud texture on top in using world position. So this works, and we would then have to do the same thing to the landscape very quickly. So I'll quickly do the same thing there, so it's obvious, very obvious what's happening. So I take the landscape and I quickly copy paste in these two, or 4 even. And you can see it actually goes over smoothly. This is the road, and you can't see the seam, because now both the landscape and the road are UV mapped in here. Okay, so that's working. Next thing though is that the entire road is now covered in sand. We need to get only the side of the road covered in sand, not the entire road. And that is something that we actually forgot to do in Max. So I close the landscape material here, the soil, and I can go back to the road. What we need to do is we need to get it to only show up on the sides, and we're going to get it to only show up on the sides because we'll use the vertex color of the mesh to identify where texture A should show up and where texture B should show up. So we will also use alert for this. This is texture A, this is texture B, but we're missing the alpha. The alpha will become the vertex color. I'm going to go back to Max. Select the roads that I'm using. So this is the new road I made earlier. I'll hide everything else. And then you need to assign vertex color to this. So in Maya it's very similar, but in Max there is a modifier called vertex paint. And that allows you to paint vertex colors. However, since this is going to be such a very low poly mesh and we need to do something so simple, I'm not even going to use that. I am instead going to use simply an edit mesh. And if you add an edit mesh, you can simply select the vertices you want to change the color on, and here it says vertex color. So all I'm going to do is select the 4 vertices on each side. These two, obviously the same there and the same on the other side. And I make those black. Like that. In Max, by default, all vertices ever made are by default white. I believe, I'm not entirely certain, but I believe that in Maya it's the other way around. Every vertex made in Maya is, I believe, by default black. So if that's the case, if you're using Maya, you should first color the entire mesh white, or make the top ones white, because otherwise everything will be black. So that's it. So the top area is white, the sides are black. You can also turn on the vertex colors. It's in this tab, and then here it says vertex color. So I enable that, and you can see it's indeed black on the edges, but the middle is white. Now the sand will become where it's black, and the road, the asphalt, will be where it's white. Then if you were to export that again, import it into Unreal, and it's very important that when you import it into Unreal, you do not right click the road, right click the mesh and do re-import, because that will skip importing vertex colors. You should actually do import again, press the import button and select the file again and import it like this. Also very important, make sure you do enable replace vertex colors or it will ignore the vertex colors. Like that. Right, so then in order to tap into those vertex colors we've made, we need to have the thing called vertex color. I'm going to use red, green or blue, it doesn't matter which one, because again, just like the foliage, if it's black, all three of them are black anyway, so I can use any one of them. I will use red. That's it. It's not obvious on this mesh, Cube is not prepared to do this. Let's try here. That appears to work, but I think I probably inverted it. Let's go back here and let's switch A and B around. And let's try it like that. Yes, and it appears to work. You can obviously see sand, asphalt where it should be, and then it's fading over to sand, and you have a nice seamless transition between the sand and the ground. And it's a very simple setup. If you would have specular and normal mapping on this as well, you would have to duplicate this setup for the normal map every time. So basically it would look like this. I'll do this very quickly. You would do it again, you can reuse that part and you can reuse the vertex color, but for for normal map and specular you would have to do it again, replace this with the specular of the sand, replace this with the specular of the road, then put that into specular, and likewise for normal. So have that as sand normal, that as road normal, and then put the whole thing in normal over there. Okay, so that's done. And then we can continue with setting up the entire landscape, and that's the most complex material of this video by far. It's a very big setup, but it's a lot of copy pasting. I can show you the finished product. Finished product would look like in this. So it's a rather big setup, but a majority of this is copy pasted. This part is the same pretty much as that, see, and there's a lot of copy pasting here as well. So it's really a lot of copy pasting. It looks more complex than it really is. And most of this we've done before. The only real thing we have not done before, again, you can see world position here, divide. This is exactly the same as what we're using on the road now, with a simple lerp here, etc. The only thing we haven't done before is basically this part. I'm opening the soil material, and the first thing you should do is add all the textures we require. Here's the soil material, so I'm going to add the different sand textures we have. It's that one, and that one. And then let's start with one part that we've not done before. One thing that you commonly get on large meshes is that you can see the tiling of the texture you're working with. Likewise here, if you really zoom out, now the lines that you can see, those are from it's a shadow artifact from dynamic lighting, so I'll turn it off for a moment. But you can see it tiles a lot. And this tiling is not going to help us. You can see this, you can see the lines of the texture disappearing in the distance. And we're going to try to break that up a bit by having the texture fade over into a bigger scale of itself in the distance. So when everything up close is this scale, is a detailed small scale, but everything far away should be the same texture but in a bigger scale, or if you wish, a second texture, to avoid the tiling. And the way we're going to set this up is by using something called a pixel depth. And a pixel depth calculates the distance between you as a camera and every pixel on the screen. So for example, it will take the position from here where I'm standing to the pixel here of the ground all the way over there, and it will say that pixel has value, let's say 16,000. This pixel next to it is slightly further, it has value 17,000. So it calculates the distance for each pixel. Each pixel on screen represents the distance away from you. That is what we will use to determine when to fade in the next texture. Now the number that outputs is much too big. Like I said, it could be 16,000, and 16,000 is not very workable. So I'm multiplying this in the same way that we divided or multiplied this. I'm multiplying this with a very small number in order to get it a bit more workable. Presuming this output 16,000, well, multiplied by 001 gives me 16. That's still a bit large, so I'm going to add another 0 to it, and that should do. Then I will add a constant clamp, because again I want to make sure that whatever this does, it stays within 0 to 1. Because I'm going to use this as a linear interpolate, as the alpha on a lerp. Let's temporarily move this underneath. We're going to need this for every setup, but I'm going to temporarily move it over here. And I'm going to temporarily use this texture, because it's the most obvious one, I think. We need this texture twice. A is as the texture is right now. B is the same texture except scaled down or scaled up. So we add a texture coordinate. And let's make it bigger. Like that. Connect to the diffuse, and then we can see how it looks. So what would happen now is that if you move away, the more you move away, the more it fades in the other color or the other texture. I can quickly add in two different colors instead to show you what happens. So if I just add a constant 3 vector and a second one, we're going to do the red and green thing again. This is red, this is green. Now when you're up close, it's red, but if you move away, it will begin to fade to green. You can see it gets ever more yellow. And by this distance, it's about green. If I now apply this to the material, you can clearly see what happens. The distance is green, but up close it's red. If I move away to the mountains over here, then it's red over here, but green over there. If I move up, the whole thing is green. So this is what I'm going to use to fade in a small texture up close, whereas the far away stuff remains, continues to have a big scale. Okay, so now I have that, and if you look in the distance, you can't really see the tiling anymore, because it actually fades over from this to this big scale. Then I'm going to do the same thing for each of the 3 textures I have. So this is setup 1. Then setup 2 is this one, which is the planar mapped one. A is that. B is the same texture but bigger. Or in fact, we can simply do this. It doesn't have to be planar mapped. The big one doesn't have to be planar mapped. It's fine as it is. So A is what we had with the planar mapping part attached to it. B is just a simple texture, same texture, but just a simple setup that simply happens to be bigger. And then the last texture, soil 3, that will be identical to this, except with that texture rather than the cracked earth one. I don't have to disconnect it. I could actually just copy paste this line in here and likewise there to update the texture. Okay, so now we have 3 groups and 3 types of sand. In my example, there's one thing that I did that you can do here as well. If I change this number, this number controls when it starts to fade over. If I make this number bigger, it will begin to fade in faster. So this is the distance basically. But if I were to change this one, then I would also manually have to go and change this one. So then I have to manually go through and change all of them. What we can do is we can tie these three together so they become a single one of them without actually pulling 3 lines out of it. So what I will do in this case is turn this into a parameter. Again, this is used for material instances, and this is something that we will continue with in the second part. But for now, I'm just going to do it like this. There's a parameter name here. I will name it distance. And the thing is, if you call the parameters all the same name, they become this different color, and that means they're linked together. So again, parameters are used for material instances, and we're not going to turn this into an instance, but I'm just going to abuse the system to make sure that if I change one of them, they all change along. When a parameter shares the same name with another parameter, they automatically become identical. So if I now select that one and I change that one into this, then all of them change. See? Now it's easy for me to tweak and everything will follow along. I think it was a bit smaller what we had. Like that. So that's the first part. We have 3 different textures basically, and each of the 3 different textures we have will fade over to a bigger version of itself over a distance. But what we need to do next is make sure we can blend these 3 textures together like we have on a real landscape. And the way we do that is, again, we're going to use vertex colors. So we're going to add something called vertex color. And I'm going to start with blending just 2 textures together. Let's start with blending the normal sand. I added a lerp here, by the way. Adding the normal sand as A on the lerp with B the cracked earth. And the vertex color we have, let's say we take the red channel as alpha. And the whole thing goes to diffuse. This will now blend this part together with this part based on the red vertex color. You approve that. Move the window away, can look at the mesh over here. And there's a tool on the left called Mesh Paint Mode. That will paint vertex colors and also textures, but we're going to just stick to the vertex color part now. Make sure you have the landscape selected, the ground mesh selected. And then select, for example, black. And try to paint some. You can paint by holding Control, same like painting foliage. Hold Control, left click and drag. And if you paint black, you will see a second texture will appear. And you can see it nicely fits with the road again. And we can nicely blend between the two. As well as this texture also fits into a bigger one if you zoom out far enough, like here. So that works. Then we can add the third texture. And that requires us to have a second lerp. So the previous result, the first lerp becomes the A of the second one, and B on that one becomes the third texture setup. So that one. And then the alpha for that is blue or green of the vertex color. So basically every color you're going to paint with is going to do something else. So if I now paint, I paint 100% red, it disappears. But if I paint, what color they use, 100% green, there's also the same texture there. Yeah, it's still the same because I forgot to hook up this. And you can see you have 3 different textures now, depending on the color you paint. If you paint white, you now get this sand. If you paint red, you get this. And if you paint green, you also have that. You need to find which color does what. If you paint blue, you get third sand. So now you have 3 different textures fading over into each other. This sand is planar mapped as we discussed before, so it blends into the road. However, the other 2 textures, they simply used UV mapping of the mesh as it was set up in Max. We could set up planar mapping for those as well, but since they don't have to blend in with the road, it's not really a big deal. Then I did one more thing in my example to further enhance this, and that is I blended a cloud texture together with the vertex color, because you can see what happens now is, especially when it gets lower poly here on the edge of the landscape, see, you can actually see the triangles. See, there's a triangle running here and there, because this follows the vertices and the triangles, see? So when you paint this, it gets very much like this. It gets very game-like. And in order to prevent that, and also in order to allow for a more varied look, because now you have to paint everything manually, and then you will still not get anything very natural. You're going to end up with something like this. So in order to further enhance that, I blended in a cloud texture on top of the alpha, on top of the vertex color, to further randomize what I'm painting with. So back to the material. I'm going to use the cloud texture that we used before, that one. Bring that in, and we're going to multiply this together with the vertex color, and the result of that will become the new alpha to use on both of these. I'll use a text coordinate to scale the cloud. And then I multiply, say, the red channel, the red cloud, together with the existing one we use, so that's red as well. And we add these 2 together, need more space. We add these 2 together as A on a lerp, and the original red vertex color is B. So we now have this. Then, as a bit of a weird setup, but for the alpha of this, we actually use the red vertex color multiplied with the alpha. And the whole setup that I'm doing here, there's various ways of getting this to work, but this is one way that I found out works. But again, you could do this in a different way. Now it gets a little bit confusing with this line, especially running here. Let's disconnect that, and this should work. So what we're now doing is we're also involving the alpha channel of a vertex color, because we can also paint alpha vertex colors. And when it's A, it uses the vertex color, the texture, a cloud texture, multiplied with a vertex color. But when it's B, it just uses the vertex color as it already was, without cloud texture. And it's based on the alpha, which is a combination of the red vertex color and the alpha. If we wouldn't multiply the red together with the alpha, then we would be able to paint that type of sand with just the alpha, and that would be incorrect. So let's see if this works. As you can see, there's a checkbox here that says alpha. If you enable that, you're allowed to paint alpha. So I'm going to enable that, and now I can paint. So let's say we paint red with 100% alpha, and the other 2 are black, and you get just simply this. However, if we now choose to paint, for example, black alpha on top of this, you can see you get this. This is a bit of a mix between the first texture and the second texture based on this cloud texture. And it looks a lot more random than it used to look. It's more subtle than these hard edges because it follows the triangles by default, but by blending a cloud on top, it gets more subtle. And the same thing can be done for the other texture. So we can do the same setup again. Let me switch these two positions so it's more clean. We can basically, for this one as well, so we can basically have a lerp again. 2 multiplies. This time we use green, however, instead of red. So just like we here multiply cloud with red, here we will multiply green with cloud. Then we will bring that to A on the lerp. And we will bring, just like we did here, the red goes to the lerp B. Here green goes to the lerp. And then the alpha, that is again the alpha multiplied with green. And then as you can see, you can paint the other texture through as well. You can increase the size. If you can't increase the size by just dragging it, you can also just click in it and just type the new size you want to have. So now it's bigger. And you can see the next problem that will pop up is that you're going to see the pattern of this cloud texture. Then you would see this. Now you can still see the tiling. This is the tiling of this one. So in order to improve that, I'm going to do the same thing with that cloud texture as I've done with the normal textures. And that is using this part. So I'm going to duplicate this again and also add that to my cloud. So I have 2 of them, just like we have 2 sands. One of them is a much bigger scale. That's maybe a bit too much. And they're lerped together. And now we can see the distance is broken up. As you move away, it changes. And from that point on, you just have to paint the terrain until it is how you want to have it. So it's a combination of the 4 sliders gives you different results. If I paint 100% alpha and 0 red, 0 green, 1 for blue, then I can just paint this texture with no variation in it, just flat color that texture. Paint it around the road because the road relies on that specific texture to blend into it. And make sure around the road it is only that texture. Also you can give the brush a fall off. It's about to fall off as well, fall off literally off the screen here, but if you tweak that, you can get a softer edge around the brush. Also, I would like to highlight that I used a mesh here to make a landscape with and not the actual landscape tool, which is this one. Instead, I chose to model the thing in Max, and I did that simply for the example because this covered several things we really needed to have, like a really big collision mesh, per-polar collision on a mesh like this, and so on. So that was just the reason why I went for a modeled landscape and didn't use a built-in landscape tool. I do have to say though that this is more efficient. This is easier to render for the engine than using the landscape tool. This is heavy. For landscape this size, it would have been a good idea to use a landscape tool. It's big enough for it to be worth the price. But what I often do see is that people make small little levels where they have a very limited amount of terrain outside, and then they create a landscape just for that small part of terrain. Just for a little bit of ground they have outside their building or such. That's not a good idea. If you use something like the landscape, then it should be worth it. And the landscape should really be big enough, like this, for it to be worth the investment. If all you're going to do is make a small little piece of ground, you're much better off memory and processing wise to simply model that and place it in the world as a static mesh. And then perhaps setting up a material like this to paint it. One final thing to note is that when we set up the lots for the rocks, what you also need to do when dealing with lots and this is a material thing, so that's why I waited with saying this until the end. But when you deal with lots, you have to enable the following property on the material that you're using. Down at the bottom it says here usage, and somewhere in here it says use with screen door fade. All the way at the bottom for me it says use with screen door fade. Enable that on every material that's used on a mesh that's lotting, because this will soften the transition between the lot steps. It will basically dissolve the first mesh while the second mesh appears. So it will dissolve in between the various lot transitions. We have now come to the end of this asset development video part 1, and I hope you learned a lot from watching this. As I mentioned before, this video has a part 2, which focuses entirely on textures and materials. It covers texture and material optimization and tricks, and how to set up a material workflow using instances and functions. In part 2 we will set up a complex material for a character and go over everything from how to get a nice reflection on metal to how to electrify, burn and dissolve things, and all of that in a technically most efficient ways.